divided group of people, a group consisting of people born during slavery, of free-born blacks, of masters' children and grandchildren, and so many more. It was a period of deep alienation. It was a period of identity crisis. This is the time of the Tuskegee machine, of the Niagara movement, of Washington, of Du Bois, of Marcus Garvey, and so many others. And as you may know, it was like each group had its own ideology and how we are supposed to progress from there on. So even if each group had the best interests of all at heart, it turned out to be a big struggle to find leadership and direction. The Back to Africa movement, for example, was attractive to some, but so was staying in America, which meant reconciling at the time two seemingly irreconcilable differences and identities. First, as an American in a country that was not fully ready to grant citizenship, and as a Black person in an environment that was hostile to Blacks. As Butterfield points out, every writer must struggle to discover who and what one is. But if you are never able to take who you are granted for, to take who you are for granted, then discovering who you really are takes on dimensions of an epic battle with the social order. This is the situation African American writers found themselves in at the dawn of the 20th century. They struggled to find their voices and to define their identities in such an environment. Some, like Count Cullen, insisted on being identified as writers, regardless of race. But others, like Langston Hughes, stood firmly behind their race, identifying themselves as tellers of their people's experiences. In the midst of all this, people like I.W. Wells said that you have to define the tasks of Black writers at that time. We all know about art for art's sake, but this was going to be art with a purpose. And this is what she said. She pointed out three objectives at the time. Task number one for the writers of the time, as far as she was concerned, was to redeem Black history from oblivion. We had already entered the 20th century and people were looking around and they were not finding a lot of Black history. So when you read most of these novels, autobiographies, you would find a lot that is bending towards telling you the history of the time and the history before that. So to redeem Black history from oblivion, you find bits and pieces of that in many of their writings at the time. Task number two was to correct the false accounts of white historians about Blacks. It was like there was a lot that was coming through, which the Blacks wanted clarified one or the other. And so they were going to do that through their writing. The third task was to make future generations of Blacks quite proud, of who they are and what they have and where they've been and what they've accomplished along the way. So you could write in any way you want. But as far as I.W. Wells was concerned, and many other people at the time, at least you were supposed to make your work count for something along those lines. William Pickens is one of those Black autobiographers who clearly put Wells's words into action, as we can see from his autobiography, Bursting Bonds. When introducing William Pickens to his readers, William Andrews, now you will hear a lot about William Andrews. William Andrews brought back this book into print in 1991. He was one of those people who go to the Library of Congress to look for manuscripts that have gone out of print and bring them back. And he has a very extensive introduction, and you will hear a lot about him. But when he was introducing William Pickens, he said, on the eve of the 1920s, the decade of the new Negro Renaissance, no Black American laid better claim to the title of New Negro than William Pickens. And with that, Andrews went on to subtitle what William Pickens had called a simple human tale as Bursting Bonds, the autobiography of a new Negro. Andrew goes on to say, and I quote, although it is commonplace to associate the term New Negro with the cultural and artistic movement celebrated by Alan Locke, who in his 1925 publication titled The New Negro, there is ample evidence of the currence of the term among Black intellectuals before that at the turn of the 20th century. Two books, one published under the auspices of Booker T. Washington, and the other written by William Pickens, are chiefly responsible for introducing the idea of the new Negro to a general leadership of the 20th century America. In 1916, William Pickens published a work, The New Negro, His Political, Civil, and Mental Status. It was a collection of his own essays dedicated, as he says, to the essential humanity and justice of the white and Black men of tomorrow. While Washington's 1900 work titled The New Negro of a New Century was concerned with proving how far the African American had come since slavery, Pickens's work allotted more space to the distance between what Blacks deserved as American citizens and what they had been forced to accept. And this turned out to be one of the major differences between the Bookerites of the Tuskegee Machine and the Du Bois camp of the Niagara movement. Although in his 1916 publication, Pickens recalled with pride all the achievements of the Blacks since emancipation and looked forward to what he called the establishment of universal human brotherhood throughout the civilized world, he goes on to be convinced that economic progress would not come without agitation. And he said, and I quote, those who have rights to acquire must be aggressive. No people ever acquired rights by sitting down and waiting for them. Rights never come, calamities come. Rights, you must go out and get them. End of quotation. Thus was born the concept of the new Negro, as exemplified by our narrative of bursting bonds. A typical specimen, as Pickens points out in his foreword. That new Negro demanded full citizenship and was convinced that what stood in the way of civil rights was primarily white prejudice fed on ignorance and baseless fear. Pickens believed that he could do much to advance the cause of racial justice by enlightening whites who, because of segregation, knew very little about the aspirations of the younger generation of African Americans like himself. Pickens vividly describes the new Negro, and here we go. The new Negro, as far as Pickens is concerned, describes the new Negro as an independent, self-respecting, self-directing, aspiring human being who should be treated as a personality and not merely as a commodity or a utility, as a co-worker with whites and no longer an instrument of them. He must be regarded first as a man and only incidentally as a usable article. And he demanded full citizenship. To introduce the new Negro as a man, bursting bonds offered the white American reader the first self-portrayal of a new Negro as an individual. In this very brief but totally engaging autobiography in two parts, Pickens turns what would have been an emotionally draining, very sad story into an enjoyable, rewarding narrative. And this is thanks to his sense of humor, his positive attitude, his use of irony, his unforgettable narrator, his enduring themes and the challenges, his great writing, and his valuable advice he gives his readers. As he states in his preface to the second edition, Bursting Bonds is clearly for the inspiration and benefit of the young, and for the satisfaction and pleasure of the more mature. Although published in 1923, Bursting Bonds is written in more or less the same environment as that which inspired, or more accurately forced, the antebellum autobiographers like Douglas to tell their stories. Okay. It begins in that familiar way of I was born. We then follow our narrator's story as he struggles, gets to know his assigned place in society, fights almost impossible battles, witnesses and experiences atrocities, learns to read and write, and eventually succeeds. Although slavery had ended, his parents were very poor farmers of the tenant or labor class and were ever on the move from cabin to cabin. His mother worked as a cook and a washerman. In order for them to make a living, they had to move from Anderson County, South Carolina, to Arkansas, where they had the soil was fertile and the wages were high. As he tells us, that move was possible only by allowing some Western farmer to pay the fares of the family through his agent, and by them signing a contract to work on that farmer's land until that debt was paid. It all sounds good until you find out that this was done according to the farmer's reckoning, not according to the family that would be signing the contract. Another name for such an arrangement was going to be new slavery in the 20th century. Pickens goes on to say that it always took the whole year of what was earned to pay for the scanty rations that were advanced to the family. And at settlement time, there would be a margin of debt to keep the family perennially bound to the virtual owner. And so Pickens' family kept moving, but with the same results. He remembers one time, and here I quote him, when the first year settlement came around and 500 bales of cotton had been produced by the family and sold by the planter, father came home with the sad faraway eyes, having been told that we were deeper in debt than on the day of our arrival, end of quotation. Then they decided that there was but one recourse left for them. That was going to be escape from that, just as they used to do during slavery. And so one night, Pickens said, the young children and some goods were piled into a wagon and the adults went on foot. By morning, we were in the town of Augusta. The family kept moving to escape debts and poverty. Till I reached the age of 18, says Pickens, I can count no less than 20 removals of our family. He later records an incident at Wiley University when one of the college boys, a fine, trustworthy fellow who drove the president's carriage, selected for that position because he was polite, tactful, level-headed, was shot by a pound officer who emptied his 6-foot shooter at the boy, claiming that the boy tried to run him over. The criminal was indicted according to Pickens, tried and lightly fined, but he took an appeal, and that was the last we heard of it. Pickens goes on to elaborate that the white population of that town and county had not yet considered a human status to the colored people who greatly outnumbered the white. Pickens narrates several other situations in that town, and this is a direct quotation. In addition to the usual operation of Jim Crowism, disenfranchisement, segregation, and denial of public accommodation and privilege, colored individuals were visited with occasional beating and bullying and in the highways and the awful terror of lynching. His imagined headlines when he fought for his sister's respect sums it all. Negro taken from the Pullman car and burned in Arkansas. Clearly, when Pickens was growing up, slavery was alive and well. And being an aspiring Negro, Pickens analyzed this environment very accurately and determined to ascend. Pickens is a very likable, respectable first-person narrator. We fall in love with this persona who, as Andrews points out, made a crucial and innovative decision in 1923 to personalize the new Negro. The narrator of Bursting Bonds is a very hardworking man who does a variety of hard, often unpleasant jobs to sustain himself. Although he was quite aware that his mother had died of overwork and consequent broken health. Immediately after his mother's death, in order to continue schooling, Pickens secured a place to earn his board by rising at 4 o'clock in the morning and also working after school hours until 7 o'clock in the evening. He also worked as a ferryman on the Arkansas River, in the stave factory, in the sawmill lumber yard, as a janitor in a certain college, in the library at Talladega, as a helper in ironworks, and so many more. Some of the character sketches he vividly paints for the reader are noteworthy, but most important is the way unpleasant people he encountered along the way are handled by him. Instead of fighting them whenever he could, the new Negro would calmly turn those experiences into valuable lessons. His beginner's algebra class in high school was one such experience. According to him, because he was so eager to do well in his hard work, his hard work did not sit well with his classmates, who, as he narrates, and I quote, set out for my scalp, for my conquest, for my undoing. They attacked me on every side. They picked every possible flaw in my work and recitations. And in their zeal, they sometimes found impossible flaws. They laughed, they ridiculed, they combined, they attacked first in one subject, then in another. And the new Negro's response to all of this, and I quote, I kept on. They only stimulated me. They filled me with the most exhilarating feeling for my work. They did for my education what no teacher in the world could have done. They made me study and learn what I had previously supposed I knew. And because of this reaction, Pickens gained their love. And once they knew that he was appreciating the work. And when he went to work in the stave factory, he met another formidable form and painted an unforgettable sketch of him for readers, saying, this man was at once and the same time about as merry and human and as cruel and brutal a fellow as my brain has ever been able to imagine. This man was hard as iron in face and heart, stout as ox in flame, tireless as machine in action. His wickedness was simple, straightforward. This man was determined to stop me from working at the factory by catching me off guard and dealing me a terrible blow rather, with a piece of heading. He was as persevering as a devil. All summer, he kept up his attack. And Pickens's response to the man, nothing that I shall record here has the least feeling of resentment towards his memory. For I regard him as one of my appointed teachers, who, whether he willed it or not, gave me a most valuable mental and moral discipline. If I should meet him today, I would shake his hand heartily as one of my benefactors, albeit he tried for weeks and weeks to knock my brains out with pieces of green barrel heading. I was on my guard. All summer I kept up my defense. I experienced any feelings like a hate. If I experienced any feelings like a hatred in the beginning, it was very soon all lost. And I came to look upon the daily action as a contest in which it was up to me to win. Usually, if a man tries constantly to hurt you and you constantly prevent him, he helps you to advance in the world. Our narrator values education, and most of the challenges he faces are because he wants to be educated. Pickens, like Douglas before him and many others, understood the power of education as a pathway to freedom, and he pursued it relentlessly. As Andrews points out, like many children of former slaves, William Pickens grew up in an atmosphere of profound reverence for learning. And Du Bois adds that this faith in the idea of book learning sustained the masses of Southern Blacks well beyond the post-Reconstruction era, and it remained the key to the creation of a leadership class of African Americans that would serve as an example to both Blacks and whites alike of the great value and potential of the Negro in the United States. Pickens is a renowned member of this class. Pickens's family stood firmly behind him in his quest. He mostly credits his mother, saying, "My mother's constant talk and ambition was to get an opportunity to school the children." And he adds, one of the chief causes of the rapid advancement of the Negro race since the Civil War has been the ambition of emancipated Black mothers for the education of their children. Many an educated Negro owes his enlightenment to the toil and sweat of a mother. When his mom passed, Pickens continued the struggle for an education with the help of his father. And this meant constant moving, as we've seen, in what clearly sounds like a response to Booker T. Washington, who did not encourage Blacks to move from the South, prompting them in his famous Atlanta Exposition address to, and I quote, cast down their bucket where they were. Pickens clearly explains, we moved to Argentina in the winter of 1891. This move steward was not prompted, as is usually charged in some cases, by any desire to get away from work, but by the high motives of education and the future. When the Argentina schools opened for the 1890-91 academic year, Pickens excitedly started school, not to miss another day during that school year, not to miss another day for the next 7 years, And indeed, as he says, not to miss another unnecessary day until he graduated from Yale in 1904. As a sample new Negro, Pickens documents his education struggles and achievements in great detail, not simply to show off, but to accomplish two goals. Goal number one, to make the young Black children aware of what they can achieve if they set goals, endure hardships, and struggle for what they want. And goal number two is better stated in his own words when, as he courageously says, he decided to win first prize in a 10-acre oratory contest at Yale. He acknowledges the task he set for himself, saying, "It is a bold thing to acknowledge, but such was my decision." And he explains his decision. "My ambition to win was stimulated by a desire to further the acquaintance of other peoples with my race. I had noticed that when I did my classwork among the best, more curiosity was awakened than when a Jew or a Japanese ranked among the best. The surprise with which I was taken struck me as due to lack of expectation in my fellows, and I would succeed in order to cause others to expect more of the American Negro." The reader follows the narrator as he journeys through his education with minute details, and I quote, "In mathematics, I never received less than 100% as daily average, and only once did I make less than 100% on an examination in that subject. The reason he says this is, and I quote, "I state this fact because so many men and women of the white race have asked me particularly how I fared in the subject of mathematics." And later on, Pickens clarifies, "Many white people have an honest opinion that the Negro mind is characteristically unmathematical." I was deeply in love with schools, Pickens says. Very often I reached the schoolhouse before the janitor arrived. From nickels and dimes which I received for errands and small jobs, I would save sufficient money to buy my books. When a reporter visited one of his schools and found the class reading Virgil's Aeneid, the teacher was eager to show off this Negro specimen. So he had him read metrically, and the next day, there appeared in that newspaper statement that the reporter found a Negro boy that possessed the language of the Romans, although he had the color of Erebus. Pickens goes on to share another incident, saying, "In that same year also, a prominent lawyer who held the office, I think, of Attorney General of the state, visited the school and saw and heard some performances in mathematics and Latin, and kindly invited me down to his office to help him convince his law partner that a Negro could learn Latin. I went on my missionary journey," says Pickens, "and after quite an extended hearing from various parts of Cicero and Virgil, and a theoretical discussion between the two lawyers about the relative value of rote learning, the partner in question acknowledged that he was convinced a Negro can learn Latin." Pickens graduated as a valedictorian of his class. Although, as he says, during that time, most of his people would have stopped their education at this juncture, our new Negro, and I quote, "saw this first graduation as a start. It filled me with the greatest desire I have ever experienced for further education. This was truly a critical time in my career. I desired to go to college, but how?" He did all kinds of jobs one more time, saved whatever he could, and with the help of a certain pastor in Little Rock, Arkansas, he applied to Talladega College in Alabama. When by early fall 1899, he had not heard from the president of Talladega, Pickens went there in person. His journey to Talladega College was another challenge he had to overcome. On that first Saturday in October, when he decided to go to Talladega, he says, the steamer was not in. So I had to cross the river and walk 15 to 20 miles to the nearest rail station. I left at daylight and caught the train at noon. I arrived safely, tuition in hand, and I was admitted. He received a BA from Talladega in 1902 and a second BA from Yale in 1904. As a new Negro, Pickens maintained his own independence, partly by supporting himself, and thanks to his hard work ethic. No worker was below him, be it hitching a horse, milking a cow, working in the garden, working as a janitor, and so many more. To demonstrate his independence, this new Negro writes, and I quote, life forced upon me, or developed within me, the habit of thinking for myself, so that I have never been afraid to stand alone. Too little afraid, perhaps. I have never had a disposition to imitate any authority, either in writing an essay, making a speech, getting a lesson into a pupil, or sketching an autobiography. This independence, in part, can help the reader to understand his relationship with Booker T. Washington. Pickens purposely distanced himself from Washington whenever he got a chance to do so. When he was invited to teach at Tuskegee after his graduation from Yale, Pickens turned the offer down and instead accepted a position at the lesser-known Talladega College. Okay, Talladega was his alma mater, but by accepting this position instead of going to Tuskegee, Pickens, as Andrews points out, took his first step towards independence. And less than 2 years later, Pickens stated clearly in his essay titled Choose that, and I quote, every intelligent and self-respecting Negro must take a non-equivocal public stand with regard to the philosophy and tactics of Washington on one hand and Du Bois on the other. Pickens is an overall great, engaging, entertaining, informative writer. He introduces the reader to crucial issues, some still with us today, in education, in the workplace, with Black people often feeling that they have to prove themselves in order to get the respect they deserve. His use of irony makes the very hard to digest story palatable. When he finds out that it is difficult for Black people to find the ancestral records, Pickens says, and I quote, there are good and sensible reasons for keeping an ancestral record of certain breeds of horses, but little reason for keeping that of slaves, simply because the worth of a man depends less upon the value and blood of his father than does the price of a horse. And on being denied an education during his childhood, Pickens says, school interests were secondary to farm interests. The raising of children must not interfere with the raising of cotton. And when the farming Blacks are cheated by white farmers, Pickens says, it was understood that the Negro was unreliable and the courts must help the poor planters. His positive attitude in face of adversity is notable. We have already heard how he handles difficult people. As he concludes his physically, emotionally, and intellectually trying narrative he titles The Age of Slaves, Pickens says, I have been impressed, not that every thought and deed in the word is good, but that the resulting line of humanist movement is in the direction of righteousness, and that human life and the word are on the whole good things. And as he concludes the whole narrative, he says, the word still seems good, not all good, but altogether interesting and always improving. The value of Pickens's narrative to the American literary scene cannot be overstated. But it is very clearly summarized by Andrews, who points out that by personalizing the new Negro in his narrative, Bursting Bonds, Pickens inaugurated an era of modern Black autobiography that came to full articulation in the memoirs of such famous new Negroes like James Weldon Johnson, Langston Hughes, Zora Hurston, concluding that Bursting Bonds might accurately have been subtitled The Making of a New Negro. Andrews goes on to say that in addition to its pioneering portrayal of the making of a new Negro, Pickens's autobiography contributed to a new frankness about the life along the color line in the 1920s, and a renewed critical perspective on the literary etiquette of Black autobiographical expression in the 20th century. Although the search for new narrative patterns and new ways to explain and authorize their meanings would carry 20th century African-American autobiography well beyond the work of William Pickens, it is important, nevertheless, to recognize the bonds he burst, both for the new Negro of the 1920s and for modern Black autobiography in general, through his pivotal contributions to African-American literary, cultural, and social history. Pickens is our permanent contemporary, and I cannot conclude this presentation about him without pointing out some precious nuggets he gives his readers. So here goes. Words of advice from William Pickens, the new Negro. I cannot fail if I try. To advance your life is but to push forward the front of your battle to find the same inspiriting struggle. You know. Now, the man who succeeds is never considered the right to fail. I really like that a lot, because humans tend to remember what you did wrong more than what you did right. You know. It is the duty of every human to see as much of the rest of the world as possible. Now, that one, number 5, has to be my favorite. While you are fighting for an ideal, you must live in the real. And this quotation has a context. William Pickens is definitely a new Negro, and he had fought very hard against segregation all his career, and so had all his colleagues along the way. But when the First World War broke out and African Americans joined in to fight, they were not treated well. In fact, they were treated very badly, discriminated and mistreated. So they looked around, and some people decided that one way they can help the African Americans in war fighting at that time was to get African American officers, you know, because they really needed their own officers in order to form their own regiments, in order to fight, in order to be treated right. And you can imagine that meant that they were going to be on their own, in their own Black people's officers training camp, if they find one. So as Pickens tells the story, he worked very hard. This other gentleman, Joey Spingham, worked very hard with him. We are in 1917, and they went ahead and established an officers training camp for Negroes, in Des Moines, Iowa, in 1917. Definitely, that is not what they had wanted, to segregate the Black fighters from the rest of the fighters. But given the situation they were in, that was the best they could do. So as Pickens reminds us, anytime you are fighting for an ideal, you must live in the real. Okay. Now, the word still seems good. Not all good, but altogether interesting and always improving. Okay. And lastly, I have been impressed, not that every single thought and deed in the word is good, but that the resultant line of humanities movement is in the direction of righteousness, and that human life and the word are on the whole good things. If we want to survive and retain our sanity, that last nugget from William Pickens is a good one to keep in mind. Thank you so much.
Yeah, we just have enough room for 5 there, so I'm going to stand at the podium as if I'm important, but we all know better. Panelists, if I can ask you to make sure to speak right into the microphone and pull it to you. You should all have switches to turn it on and off. So if you're afraid when you're not speaking that your breathing or whatnot might get caught up by the mic, you can turn it off and then turn it back on when it's your turn to speak. But looking over the Zoom broadcast from the first session, I noticed that anytime I turned away from the microphone, most of what I said was lost. So I'm going to try to be very mindful of that. So let me make some quick reintroductions, everybody. Immaculate, thank you once again. Next to Immaculate, to her right, we have Verby Prevost, the previous holder of the Connor Professorship and Professor Emerita of English. To Verby's right, we have Gail Dawson, Associate Professor of Management in the College of Business, the Rollins College of Business, and poet. We got 2 poets on stage tonight. To Gail's right, we have Hannah Wakefield, Assistant Professor of English, teaches African-American literature and early American literature. And to Hannah's right, we have Professor Earl Braggs, the Herman Battle Professor of African-American Studies, Professor of Creative Writing as well. Thank you, panelists, for being here. And so, Immaculate, I'll give you a chance to rest and catch your breath. Thank you again for a great presentation. Verby, let's start with you. You apparently have a bee in your bonnet. You usually do.
In my bonnet.
You're more interesting that way, so buzz away. I've got a few in my own, so please.
Well, first of all, I want to thank Immaculate for introducing me to this book. Typically for me, and when we do a Take 5, there, I know most of the books, but there's always 1 or 2 new ones. And this one was one I did not know at all. And I am delighted to get to know. A couple of things that really struck me. One, I was intrigued, and I can't decide, maybe a little put off by Andrew's referring to Pickens as militant at one point. And I thought, militant? I don't think so. Maybe in comparison to Booker T. Washington, maybe in comparison to some of the others at the time. But I like the term activist. He definitely was an activist, and I love the term for him, courageous. I mean, he was incredibly courageous, but he was in a lot of situations where he showed that courage, but where he did not do anything to ever initiate or try to cause trouble. I mean, he was very very aware of what's, how situations could go, and was very, very shrewd and careful. And so militant, I had a little problem with that term. I don't know if anybody else did or not. Especially when you think about really being militant. I mean, come on. The other thing, there were a couple of other things that struck me, but one, the whole question of morality that he hits a couple of times, and it comes up, I think, anytime we're dealing with the whole slavery issue. I'm very much attuned to how Faulkner thought that the morality of the white man was so screwed up because of slavery and the racism, and how it affected both whites and blacks. But I was particularly impressed by this quotation on page 6. An inevitable but not inalterable dual moral system has grown up in the interracial life of the South. A Negro may be tolerated by his own race in doing for a white man what would not meet with toleration if done for himself. You're talking about the fact that he would go serve liquor and he was supposed to do it, but he would, do it because it was seemingly forced to in this situation. And a white man may be excused by his own race if he does to a Negro what would be instantaneous condemned if done to a white man. And I just think that's just an extremely telling statement to me. Sort of along with that, and then I'll give somebody else a chance.
Sure.
Is what I thought was one of the most ironic statements, but one that we've known to be so true. On page 55, when he talks about being abroad and about all the people that they would meet, and inevitably, if there's somebody that was treating them terribly, it was going to be an American. And he points out the irony here. He says, if a fellow was from Mississippi, and I can say this because I'm from Mississippi, I can speak bad here about it. If a fellow was from Mississippi where he had slept in the bed and suckled at the breast of a black nurse, he made the biggest fuss of anybody. Some of it was ludicrous. We had great fun. He recognizes, how loose, and the whole situation of how they fed them, they took care of them, they ate them, and then, it's so terribly ironic, and it suggests again how screwed up the thinking was.
I guess for me, part of the lore of the book was his description of his childhood. And I was particularly drawn to this because I looked at the date he was born in 1881, which is 1 year before my grandfather was born. And looking at my family history, looking at the grandfather was born in 1882. He was a farmer. His father actually owned the farm that they lived on and that kind of thing. But on my mom's side of the family, my grandfather was a sharecropper. And hearing the description of how every year they were more and more in the hole and they could never catch up. And the whole, the shame of what sharecropping was, which was really an extension of slavery.
Yeah.
There was no way that you could ever get ahead. There was no way that you could ever get out of debt. There was just to have that connection and to kind of get a glimpse of what my grandparents' lives were like, Also with his emphasis on education, but being a sharecropper, he really didn't get a chance to go to school as much. And hearing the stories even from my father grew up in the Eastern Shore of Maryland on the farm that his grandfather had bought somewhere between 1870 and 1880. But hearing him talk about how they had a shortened school year, even in the time of my parents, that everything was about getting the fields planted. And my dad actually did some of the same things that he did. My dad was telling me that from the time he was 8 years old. He had to get up early to work at somebody else's farm and do the chores before he walked to school. And then when he came home, he had to do his chores on his farm. So hearing some of that and the resilience of some of the people and how they were so insistent on getting an education and the lengths at which they were willing to go in order to make sure that they got an education, because education was really a way out for them. Also looking at how determined he was and how he stepped out on faith, even though he wasn't sure he was going to be able to go to school, to college. He hadn't gotten the letter back about being able to get into college, yet he stepped out on faith and said, well, I'm going to do the things that I know I need to do and just do it. And the belief that if he did what he could, that everything else would work out. That's just such a great lesson and such a great motivation for me.
All right. Yeah, thank you, Immaculate, for a great talk. And this is my first time reading this as well, so it's great. I'm going to take this moment to tease our next talk about Zora Neale Hurston, because Pickens and Immaculate mentioned this, that Pickens was writing to inspire the next generation. And one of the people that he inspired and helped along was actually Zora Neale Hurston, who was a writer from Florida, wrote the novel Their Eyes Were Watching God. In 1917, Hurston was essentially homeless and penniless in Baltimore. She had lost her mom, like Pickens had lost his mom. So, and she had a terrible relationship with her father. She was far away from her native home in Florida, and she was working as a waiter during the day to try to raise money to go to a night high school in Baltimore. And she was doing that. But she worked up the nerve, partially because of a teacher who helped her out. She worked up the nerve to apply to Morgan College in the hopes that she could get in, even though she didn't have the money to do that. And so I think we can picture this meeting she had with the dean. The dean of Morgan College at the time was William Pickens. And so she had this meeting with William Pickens. And this is what she said about William Pickens in her autobiography. She said, William Pickens, a Negro, was the dean there, and he fooled me too. I was prepared to be all scared of him and his kind. And I think by his kind, she means these educated, elite African Americans. I'd be all scared of him and his kind. I had no money and no family to refer to. I just went, and he talked to me. He gave me a brief examination and gave me credit for 2 years' work in high school and assigned me to class. Knowing that I had no money, he evidently spoke to his wife because she sent for me a few days later and told me enthusiastically that she had a job for me that would enable me to stay in school. And she said that every day that she was at Morgan College, she was in William Pickens' household. So she saw his family life as well. And it's funny that he was referred to as militant, because the way she described him is he was a man who came home at night and played with his kids and had a soft spot for his youngest daughter. So she really saw their family up close. But I think it's just a cool moment because we see people do that for him in his autobiography. Yeah. And then we see him passing that along to Hurston and inspiring that next generation of Harlem Renaissance writers.
Thank you. Great presentation. Pickens believes that he could do much to advance the cause of racial justice by educating whites who because of racial prejudices and segregation, knew so little about African Americans. Example of that is the definition before Obama. The prevalent definition was the 6 o'clock news Negro. Then comes Obama, and he changed all of that. Now, these are not absolutes, but I want you to think about how a Black president started to redefine the definition of the Negro. Pickens believed that white prejudiceness was fed on ignorance and baseless fear. I would argue that it's not baseless. I think racial prejudiceness in America is and was based on a solid American foundation, an almost seemingly indestructible foundation. The validity of the base, in my mind, is the question. And in my Zen way of seeing things, the answer is always in the question. So in your mind, answer these questions, if you will. Why was there so much resistance to integrating the American school system? Why a white drinking fountain and a Black drinking fountain? Why in the mid-1900s were white service workers discouraged from taking tips from Black professionals? Why was it unlawful in many states for a white family to adopt a Black child? The answer: to create and perpetuate two complexities: a superiority complex for whites, an inferiority complex for Blacks. This, the basis of, holds solid as long as the races are kept separated. The comedian Dick Gregory, civil rights activist, vegetarian activist, talks about the first time he went to an integrated school. And the teacher gave back the papers, and he was sitting next to this white kid. And he noticed that the white kid had got an F on his paper. And he couldn't believe it. Could not believe it. Because he had been socialized to believe that whites were academically and otherwise superior to Blacks. I call it tell, don't show philosophy. I call it tell, don't show philosophy. In other words, I tell you who these people are. I define these people are for you, but I don't allow you to see these people. My personal experience with this was the opposite of Dick Gregory's experience. I knew from my earliest observations and realizations. I grew up in a white community. My first best buddy was a white boy. My first girlfriend was a white girl. The second, third, fourth, the same. Among the white kids I grew up with, one or two may have been smarter than me, but most of them were a lot less smart than I was. So no one has ever been able to tell me that someone is better than me because of race. So again, the way that this whole racism thing is perpetuated, has been perpetuated through separation.
I've got a few remarks to make as well. Immaculate. One of your slides, I think your second or third slide, this may have come from Ida B. Wells when she was talking about the different objectives of Black writers in the United States. The second of which is to correct false accounts of white historians about Blacks. And, just the insidiousness of those false accounts, but the strength of them in part through their insidious nature. On 69, this is in that really tense scene in the Pullman car. And it's amazing, what a long life he had and how many experiences he had in it. And yet how slim the volume is here. So the things that make it into this volume, you really got to think stand out. And you can see why that episode from the Pullman part of his life would stick out. But as this is taking place, he's imagining himself being lynched. And what's so fascinating about it is that he knows every last line of that verse, this narrative, this formula of the lynching narrative about what the whites will say about him, their justifications for lynching him. This is at the bottom of page 69. And if you read Ida B. Wells, of course, you see that this formula plays out time and again with such regularity, such predictable regularity. One thing I felt very keenly conscious of, the lies that would be told by the newspapers next day. After I was mobbed and murdered, I would be accused in the whole civilized press of having attacked everybody in the car, of having abused, insulted, annoyed. As a fact, I had uttered less than 100 words and had molested nobody. And Verby, this goes to what you were saying about his enormous self-restraint. And I just got me to thinking about early on in his autobiography, he talks about measuring progress through syllables when he's younger and the little reader that he has and just how few syllables would go into 100 words. That sense of restraint, that's a enormous level of maturity and foresight. But back to 69. Sorry, lost it. But I could see the headlines. Quote, Negro taken from Pullman car and burned in Arkansas. Burning being one of these features of a lynching after the body was killed. Not always after, but often. Then there were the details. Quote, Negro said to have been drunk, got on train and began to use insulting language. And then you see in italics, to the ladies. And of course, this is such a regular feature of these lynching narratives, is that there is some aggressive Black man making eyes on a white woman. And he knows this narrative and how it's going to play out. Some of the white men tried to quiet him when he pulled a gun and shot wildly, wounding 2 or 3 people. I think all he had in his hand at the time was a book, wasn't it? Yeah. The conductor wired ahead and a posse met the train. The mob, which had gathered at the station, overpowered the officers, and the Negro, fighting madly, was chained to a lamppost saturated with gasoline. And, this lynching narrative now has become so predictable, so rote, that he can imagine himself, and I got to imagine he's imagining it as this whole scene is playing out in the Pullman car. And that this may be the way that all of his colleagues and friends at the various places he's been, the schools, will learn about his demise. But it goes to speak to that power of, let me just read it again, as you said it, Immaculate, the false accounts of white historians about Blacks. That by this point, that lynching narrative has become so insidious, so powerful, that he knows exactly the role he would play. And questions or thoughts?
Another thing that really struck me about the book is how optimistic he could remain with everything he had experienced and everything that he saw. Basically, he still saw the world as good. He saw progress is being made.
Yeah.
And I kept thinking of Martin Luther King in this, that whole idea that Martin Luther King, through all of it, he experience went through, was able to say the arch of justice moves toward, toward the arch moves toward justice
Yeah.
in the long term. And that's to get the feeling here. He feels that. And I'm thinking, I'm just so amazed at somebody that could feel that way. And of course, that's probably what kept him going.
Yeah.
And got it.
He would have had plenty of reasons to think otherwise. Yeah.
Oh, yeah.
Plenty of reasons to think otherwise. Thoughts, comments, questions? Anything? Oh, yeah. He learned that lesson about the syllables and about economy of English. Yeah.
Repeat or comment. Soon.
Yeah, if for those in the back who couldn't hear, the comment is just how economical this book is, that it's so precise, the language is so precise. And I think that's one thing that could be overlooked, but we probably shouldn't, is just, that this is a real craftsman at his craft here, a writer, and that he can create in such a slim volume, such an impact, and give such visceral detail to such important events.
And he said at one point something to the effect, I can't remember the exact wording now, that he was just going to say it and leave it up to the reader.
Mhm.
Do you remember what I'm talking about? And I think he does that, but he says it in such a way, I mean, the reader gets it.
Actually, when I finished the book and I read it once, I just couldn't put it down. But it made me mad, and it made me sad that I never heard of it.
Yeah.
He was a great man. Thank you, man.
Yes, indeed, Immaculate. Yep.
I still would never, and that's just wrong.
Well, and Sally, just to amplify your point, if you look at the preface to the second edition, so it's right before the first page, you see where he wrote it when he wrote the continuation of the autobiography, Bursting Bonds. You see it's really two autobiographies put together, a continuation. 260 West 139th Street. Now, if I'm correct, I think Harlem begins at 125th Street, which is to say he's in Harlem in 1923. He's in the middle of it. And yet, to amplify your point, he's overlooked. God knows who his neighbors were, 3 blocks down or 2 blocks north or, 5 blocks south. Yeah. It's a real misfortune then that he's been overlooked. Earl, you were going to say something, please.
Yeah, I found the quote I think Burbage was referring to, leave the work of the things I say to the judgment of the audience.
Yeah. I think that was just really very telling remark.
Yeah, and that.
Rick, go ahead, Rick, and then Hannah, please.
I agree with you. Amazing. I want to reread it. I found that I was so appreciative of his love for and appreciation of his wife, and I was appreciative of her contribution. Kind of played me through. Examples of that throughout. Moves, great also.
I would like to know more about her. Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I agree. Hannah, you were going to say something.
Yeah, I was just gonna say that that style, that sort of factual style, getting back to your point, Ruby, of just leaving things as they are, just, sharing the facts and letting them sit with the reader. Also, Wells Barnett has come up multiple times, also links her with Ida B. Wells Barnett, whose lynching pamphlets were the same way. Just present the facts and let them interpret themselves.
He seems very mindful of language, right down to the syllable. How to economize, when not to. And at one point, when you remember, he's trying to recoup that $6. Yeah, another just, of all the things he could write about in this autobiography, that makes it in there. I'm just trying to find this is on page 61. He knows when to use many syllables and when to use just a few. And the woman asks him, did you get that money? This is at the bottom of page 61. I did not get the money, is how he responds. And he says in quotation, or excuse me, in parentheses, no or yes, just those, either that word or the other would have been too abrupt. Very mindful then of what a one-syllable word would do to ignite this woman into God knows what kind of accusations. Down to that level of, detail in the language is pretty sharp.
I thought it was significant too, when he talks about how he's dealing with the woman now, when it was the man who owed him the money. And it gets into the whole, how things were set up. If he had been disrespectful or perceived as being disrespectful to her, that would have set a lot of other things in motion.
Yeah.
And how he had to know all sides of it to be able to act in a way that would not get him lynched.
Right. Right. He wouldn't meet with her, just the two of them. Yeah.
And as you mentioned, how he would just set things there and move on. Somewhere he said, first we learn and then we die. Find that as puzzling as I did. I'm sorry, I didn't expect to say that, so I don't. I believe it was maybe right after this trip.
First we learned, then we died. 55, thank you.
I guess you were puzzled, right?
When we had just learned how to.
Yeah, that's the key phrase. When we just learned how to live, then we die. Yeah, I think to me, again, he's just stating an unfortunate truth about life. I mean, it takes us a lifetime to learn.
And the context of that,
you don't learn in a lifetime.
the context of that is that he had learned how to live in Europe, right? Or I mean, he'd just come back from Europe and then he was moving on to a new, just to make sure I understand the context of that, right? So it wasn't a literal death, but that something,
Back into.
yeah.
Yeah, I felt that was a very human moment. I just underlined it and said, great sentence. But it's full of great human moments that just speak to everybody's experience, because I feel that all the time.
Yeah.
I thought the book was about to take a very nasty turn.
With a sentence like that, yeah.
But yeah, hasn't he been through enough already?
This trip takes place, I think, a year before the First World War starts. And my thought was, oh God, he's going to get himself in there and he can't get back home, or, he's going to find himself in the middle of the Western Front or something. Not that, but yeah. Any last thoughts? Any last remarks? Well, if not, Hannah Wakefield on, I get my dates right. So I make sure to give them to the refreshment folks. March 8th. March 8th. Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God, a real Harlem Renaissance classic, 1937. So please come either in person or online. Hannah Wakefield will be presenting on it. And bring the good weather with you, will you? March 8th. Thanks again, everybody. Have a good night. Thank you.